The telemetry was wrong before they even finished decelerating. Cale Orenthi felt it in the numbers first. A tightness in the data stream, a density where there should have been silence. He stood at the forward sensor station of the Seedwatcher ascending, his three-jointed fingers hovering above the console, and watched 90,000 years of certainty begin to crack. Cale, Navigator Shale's voice came from 2 tiers below, clipped and professional. We have arrived at approach threshold. Sol system, confirming stellar coordinates match the original seeding record. Confirmed, Cale said, though he was not looking at the coordinates. He was looking at the electromagnetic spectrum readout, and the electromagnetic spectrum readout was screaming. He should not have been surprised. Some part of him, the part that had read every archived expedition report during the 18-month transit from the convergence staging point, had whispered that the numbers might not match the projections. 90,000 years was a long time, even for the Ketharan convergence. The original seeding team had planted their markers and departed Sol 3 with the serene confidence of gardeners who knew exactly what they had planted and exactly how long it would take to grow. Their models had been precise. Their timelines had been unanimous. The indigenous primates would develop tool use within 10,000 years, rudimentary agriculture within 20, and then, based on every other seeded population in the convergence's 200,000-year history, they would plateau. They would build small civilizations, fight small wars, exhaust their accessible resources, and eventually stabilize into a manageable pre-technological society that the convergence could return to harvest for genetic diversity and cognitive templates. That was the experiment. That was what Cale was here to check on. The experiment had been running for 90,000 years without a single monitoring visit. The reason was bureaucratic, which made it worse. The convergence had seeded 11 worlds across the Orion arm. Sol 3 had been the 7th. By the time the seeding team filed its final report and moved on to the 8th world, the convergence's political landscape had shifted. The border consolidation had consumed 3 generations of resources and attention. The Seeding Bureau had been folded into the Office of Long-Range Assets, which had buried its active files under 9 layers of administrative review. Nobody had forgotten about Sol 3. The file was still there, sitting in a database that was itself sitting inside a larger database. The planet still appeared on the master chart, its status listed as monitoring pending. But nobody had gone to look. Until now. Until Cale had dug the file out as part of his doctoral thesis on seeding outcomes, and the academic board had funded a monitoring expedition. Small, quiet, 1 ship with a crew of 31, not a military vessel. The Seedwatcher Ascending was a research cruiser with deep-range sensors and a comfortable observation deck, and no expectation whatsoever that it would encounter anything requiring weapons. No seeded population in convergence history had ever developed past classification 3. The models were clear on this point. The genetic markers the convergence planted were specifically calibrated to cap development. Subtle neural pathway limitations that created cognitive ceilings, preventing the compound innovation that led to runaway technological progress. Every other seeded world in convergence history had obeyed the ceiling. Every single one, across 200,000 years of monitoring data. Cale, are you reading the M output? Shale's voice had changed. The professional clip was gone, replaced by something Cale had never heard from the veteran navigator in 3 years of shared missions. It sounded like confusion trying very hard not to become alarm. I am reading it. Those numbers cannot be right. Cale enlarged the display. The electromagnetic spectrum from Sol 3 should have been mostly natural. Solar radiation reflected from atmosphere and surface, perhaps some faint organized signals if the population had discovered radio within the last few centuries. The models predicted that possibility with about 12% probability. Weak signals, disorganized, the electromagnetic equivalent of a child learning to speak. What the Seedwatcher's sensors were detecting was not a child learning to speak. It was a civilization roaring across every frequency. The ship could monitor structured signal density so vast that the translation matrix had overloaded and restarted twice during the initial sweep. The output dwarfed the Ketharan homeworld. It dwarfed every convergence colony world Kale had ever visited. The sheer volume of organized electromagnetic traffic from this single planet exceeded the combined output of the 11 nearest star systems in the Convergence database. Dr. Orenthi, Chief Biologist Sarith, climbed the ladder from the lower deck, her research tablet pressed against her chest. Her wide amber eyes were fully dilated, which in Ketharan physiology indicated either extreme darkness adaptation or profound shock. The observation deck was brightly lit. "The atmospheric readings are back. You need to see this." "I am occupied with the M spectrum." "This takes priority." Sarith reached the sensor tier and held up her tablet. "I ran the atmospheric composition against the seeding baseline from 90,000 years ago. Nitrogen-oxygen ratio is almost identical. The biosphere survived, but look at the trace gases." Kale looked. Carbon dioxide was lower than the seeding baseline. Not higher, lower. Particulate matter was negligible. The atmosphere was cleaner than it had been when the Convergence seeding team had stood on the surface and taken their original measurements 90 millennia ago. That was not natural equilibrium. Natural equilibrium did not produce numbers like these. "Active atmospheric scrubbing at continental scale," Sarith said. Her voice was very quiet. "Someone with the technology to clean an entire world's air, continuously, while maintaining the planetary biosphere in optimal condition. This is not possible at any classification below 6. Classification 3 was the cap. Stone walls, bronze tools, sailing ships at most. The genetic governors ensured it. "Shale," Kale said. "Bring us to standard monitoring orbit. Passive sensors only. Reduce our emission signature to minimum." "Already done." I reduced emissions the moment the M readings came in. "Kale, if there is a technological civilization on that planet, they may have already detected us." "Then we proceed carefully." Carefully meant slowly. Carefully meant hours of painstaking sensor work, layering data over data, building a picture of what waited at the end of a 90,000-year absence. Each hour brought new impossibilities, each one larger than the last. In the first hour, Kale ordered a full spectral analysis of the planet's night side. What came back was not the scattered pinpoints of firelight that the seeding models predicted. It was a grid, a glowing, organized, continent-spanning grid of habitation that covered 6 landmasses in patterns so regular they could only be the product of centralized infrastructure planning on a scale the Convergence had never attempted. The light was not raw combustion. It was controlled illumination, emissions consistent with directed energy lighting systems of extraordinary efficiency. The night side of the planet blazed like a jewel in the dark, and every photon was evidence that the models were wrong. In the second hour, Sarith completed a preliminary geological survey. The planet's resource profile should have shown the telltale signatures of civilizational extraction: depleted mineral deposits, altered water tables, atmospheric contamination from industrial processes. The Convergence's own home system showed those scars clearly, even after 200,000 years of remediation efforts. Sol 3 showed none of them. The mineral deposits were intact. The water tables were stable. The ocean chemistry was within 1% of the seeding baseline. Either the civilization on this planet had not industrialized, which was contradicted by every other reading, or it had industrialized without causing any damage in the first place. That second possibility was something the Convergence had theorized about but never achieved in 200 millennia of trying. These people had done it. In the third hour, Shale detected something that changed the tactical picture entirely: a network of sensor buoys in the outer system. Small, passive, nearly invisible against interstellar background radiation. They had been tracking the Seed Watcher since it entered the system. The buoys were old, their technology weathered by centuries of deep space exposure. They had been placed long before the Seed Watcher arrived. "How many?" Cale asked. 417 confirmed so far. The network extends well past the heliopause. They are not just passive detectors. Each contains a data relay and a low-power transmitter aimed inward toward the planet. They reported our arrival approximately 6 hours before we reached approach threshold. This species had ringed its star system with early warning sensors and waited, not for a specific threat, but for any arrival from outside. They had been watching for someone like Cale for a very long time, and they had known he was coming before he knew what was waiting. "In the Convergence's history," Rathan said from the cultural station, "how many seeded populations have developed sensor networks beyond their own atmosphere?" "None," Sareth answered. The highest achieving seeded world developed basic optical telescopes approximately 14,000 years after seeding. Classification 3. The engineering required for a system-wide passive detection network of this density exceeds our own. The Convergence maintains 93 relay stations. These people have 417, distributed across a volume roughly 4 times larger. The 4th hour brought the orbital infrastructure into sensor range, and escalating disbelief became something closer to vertigo. The orbital space around the planet was occupied. Not cluttered with debris the way newly spacefaring civilizations left their orbital lanes, occupied with purpose. Organized with the meticulous precision of a species that had been building in space for a very long time. Cale counted the platforms first. Hexagonal structures arranged in concentric rings at varying altitudes, each one between 4 and 12 kilometers across, surfaces studded with sensor arrays and energy collectors and systems he could not identify. There were hundreds of them. They formed a layered shell around the planet, dense enough that anything approaching would pass through at least 3 overlapping fields of coverage. Between the platforms, filaments of directed energy pulsed in coordinated rhythms, connecting the structures in a web so tight that from the Seed Watcher's distance, the planet appeared to wear a net of light. The filaments were not decorative. Each one carried enough directed energy to slag a Convergence cruiser. Cale could read the spectral signatures, and each one told the same story. This was a civilization that had built defensive infrastructure of staggering capability, and then woven it into the fabric of its daily architecture. Then he found the ships. The first one he identified was in a high polar orbit. When the sensors resolved it clearly, Cale's hand stopped moving entirely. 9 kilometers long. Its hull was a deep matte material that absorbed sensor returns rather than reflecting them. The Seed Watcher had nearly missed it. Its silhouette was angular, built with functional brutality that spoke of weapons and armor and a species that had learned the universe could be hostile. Banks of directed energy arrays lined its flanks. Smaller vessels docked along its spine like attendants. It was not alone. 41 ships of comparable or greater size occupied the orbital lanes, moving in overlapping patrol arcs that the Seed Watcher's tactical computer was mapping with increasing alarm. The threat assessment indicator, a standard Convergence metric Cale had never seen above advisory yellow in his entire career, was red. Had been red since the 6th warship was counted and stayed there as the count climbed past 20, past 30, past 40. Dozens of smaller vessels moved between the warships in coordinated traffic patterns. Several were entering and leaving the atmosphere in smooth parabolic arcs. Routine transit, which meant surface spaceports, which meant this was not a military deployment in response to their arrival. This was a civilization's normal operating posture. They maintained 41 capital warships in orbital patrol the way you might keep a light on in the hallway, not because of a specific threat, because they had decided as a species that they would not be caught unprepared. The tactical computer is requesting permission to classify the orbital infrastructure as a hostile environment, Shale reported. Standard protocol when threat assessment exceeds threshold parameters. Deny the classification, Kale said. We are not in a hostile environment. We are in someone's home. Sareth brought her tablet forward again, her scientific focus overriding the fear that had silenced most of the crew. Energy output calculations on the orbital platforms alone exceed the entire output of the Convergence home system, all 400 worlds combined. And that is just the orbital platforms, before counting the warships, the surface grid, or the outer system installations. These people are not energy limited in any measurable way. The Convergence has been energy limited for its entire history. Every expansion decision, every military deployment, every colonial project constrained by energy budgets. These people have solved the fundamental constraint entirely. Run a full system sweep, Kale ordered. Everything between the star and the heliopause. What Sareth found made the orbital infrastructure look modest. Mars, the system's fourth planet listed in the seeding records as a frozen desert with a trace atmosphere, was green. Not partially green. Green across its entire northern hemisphere, brown and cultivated in the south, with oceans and river systems that ran for thousands of kilometers across what had once been barren rock. Someone had terraformed an entire planet and the work looked old. Weathered, established, the kind of settled permanence that spoke of millennia, not centuries. How long to terraform a Mars-class world? Kale asked. The Convergence's best projection is approximately 8,000 years with current technology, Sareth said. Their work was completed well over 1,000 years ago. The biosphere is mature and fully self-sustaining. They did it faster than our best models predict we could. The asteroid belt was organized. Not mined out, organized. Fragments sorted, positioned, threaded with transit lanes and navigational beacons. Refineries and processing stations at strategic points throughout. Beyond the belt, installations orbited Jupiter's moons. Saturn had monitoring stations and what appeared to be research facilities. At the system's edge, a deep space observatory pointed its sensor arrays toward Convergence space. The installation's age suggested it had been watching the Convergence's corner of the galaxy for approximately 12,000 years. They have industrialized their entire solar system, Sareth said. This is not a planetary civilization. This is a stellar civilization. Total system population estimates based on infrastructure density and energy consumption, approximately 35 billion across all installations. Rathan spoke from the rear of the deck. His silver scales had lost their luster entirely, the involuntary Ketharan response to sustained cognitive dissonance. The Convergence took 40,000 years to develop system-wide infrastructure. These people have done it in less than 6,000, based on the outer installation ages. And the Convergence's total population across 400 worlds is 41 billion. A single species, in a single star system, has reached 87% of our total numbers. Classification, Kale asked. He already knew. He needed to hear it said. Sareth's amber eyes found Kale's. Classification 7, minimum, possibly 8. The observation deck went silent, not the productive silence of people thinking, the blank silence of people whose conceptual framework had just been destroyed. Classification 7 was the Ketharan Convergence, the pinnacle of known civilizational development, achieved across 200,000 years of unbroken continuity, 400 light-years of territorial expansion, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of 8,000 generations. Classification 8 meant they had been surpassed. By the seventh world they had seeded, by a species they had designed to remain primitive. The implications radiated outward in every direction. If the governors could be overcome, the entire seeding program was compromised. If one species could reach Classification 7 independently, the Convergence's developmental models were fundamentally flawed. If those models were flawed, every policy decision built on them across 200,000 years of civilizational strategy was built on incorrect assumptions. The governors failed, Kale said, or they were overcome. The result is the same. He watched the words land on his crew, watched each one absorb the meaning. They have developed past us. Kale, Shale's voice came from below, urgent. We have been detected. A focus scan from the platform at bearing 037 has locked our position. Kale's 3 hearts beat in rapid sequence. Can we withdraw? Not before they intercept. At their technology level, they certainly have FTL-capable interceptors. We are deep inside their defensive perimeter. He had brought 31 people to check on a garden, and the garden had become a fortress built by the flowers they had planted. Power down everything except passive sensors and life support. Broadcast our identity on the standard convergence diplomatic frequency. Ship name, registry, mission classification. Let them know we are not hiding. The Seed Watcher went quiet. Non-essential systems darkened. 31 people breathing in the near dark, waiting. Kale stood at the forward window and looked at the distant planet. Blue and white and green, wreathed in the thin, bright line of atmosphere. A garden world. He thought about the original seeding team. 12 researchers, a support crew of 40 performing what they considered a routine procedure. They had walked on the surface. They had seen the indigenous primates, cataloged the local biology, implanted the genetic governors, and departed. Total time on surface, 41 days. The seeding report described the process in clinical language. Genetic markers introduced via atmospheric vector. Integration confirmed in 97.3% of the target population within 1 generation. Cognitive ceiling parameters verified. And a footnote. Recommend monitoring visit within 30,000 years to assess developmental progress and readiness for harvesting. 30,000 years had passed, then 60,000 more. Nobody came. Kale turned to Rithan. I need a cultural assessment. They detected us but have not scrambled ships. Their warships have not changed patrol patterns. What does that tell you? Rithan swallowed. They are not threatened. They detected a single vessel at the system's edge and did not react defensively. They are either supremely confident or they were expecting us. Or both, Kale said. Before either could say more, the communications officer spoke. Her voice cracked on the first word. We are being hailed, broadband. Multiple frequencies. They are hailing us in Ketharin. Every crew member froze. Kale felt the fur along his spine rise. Formal Ketharin, sir. High dialect. Archaic pronunciation but grammatically perfect. The translation rendered on screen. Vessel of the KETHARAN Convergence. We have been expecting a visit for some time. You are welcome in soul space. Please hold your current position and a guide vessel will escort you to a designated approach corridor. We mean you no harm. We have questions for you, as we expect you have questions for us. They found the seeding markers, Sareth whispered. They decoded them. They know who we are and where we came from. A tight beam followed, directed at the Seed Watcher alone. A voice in Ketharin, shaped by a different mouth. Vowels harder, consonants faster, the accent of a species that had learned the language from intercepted transmissions rather than living speakers. Ketharin vessel, this is Saul approach control. Guide ship dispatched. Transit time 4 minutes. Please confirm receipt. 4 minutes. 11,000 kilometers. Kale did the math on their propulsion capabilities and felt another certainty fall away. Confirm receipt. Tell them we are a research expedition. Unarmed, 31 crew. The response came in 40 seconds. Acknowledged. We have prepared a reception on the surface. Dr. Orenthi, we have been reading your academic publications on seeding outcomes with great interest. We look forward to discussing your conclusions in person. They knew his name. They had breached Convergence academic databases. A seeded population that should have been chipping flint had read his doctoral thesis. The observation deck erupted into controlled chaos. Sareth was pulling up communication protocols. Rathan was dictating rapid notes into his recorder. Two junior researchers had frozen at their stations entirely, unable to process the conceptual distance between the species described in the seeding files and the species currently speaking to them in their own language. Cale gripped the console edge. "Everyone, listen." The noise subsided. "What we have found is unprecedented. Nothing in Convergence history prepares us for this situation. But we are researchers, not soldiers. We came to observe and report. That is still our mission. We will accept their escort. We will land where they direct us. We will observe everything, record everything, and when we return, we will have the most important data set in 200,000 years of civilizational history. Fear is appropriate. Panic is not. We are scientists." The guide ship arrived in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Small by human standards, roughly twice the Seedwatcher's size, but its hull was made of the same sensor-absorbing material as the warships. It moved with fluid precision that spoke of propulsion technology beyond anything in the Convergence engineering database. It fell into formation beside the Seedwatcher and broadcast a navigational corridor through the orbital infrastructure. Shale followed. Cale stood at the observation window and watched the platforms pass, close enough now to see detail. Dome structures, green spaces visible through transparent sections, the movement of vehicles and figures inside. People living on orbital stations as casually as if gravity and atmosphere were guaranteed rather than engineered. He pressed closer to the glass and saw children on one of the platforms, running across a green field beneath a dome that contained what appeared to be actual weather. Clouds, rain, shifting wind patterns. They had built weather inside their orbital stations because they wanted their children to grow up knowing what rain felt like. The guide ship's transit advisories scrolled across the navigation console. Population of Earth orbital infrastructure, approximately 3 billion permanent residents, not workers on rotation, residents, 3 billion people living in stations that contained forests and rivers and weather systems and schools and amphitheaters. They had not merely industrialized space. They had domesticated it, made it home. The guide ship led them through a gap between two platforms, and beyond it, Cale saw something that stopped his breath entirely. A shipyard, an orbital construction facility of a scale that made the Convergence's largest dry docks look like repair berths. A vast open ring of alloy and energy scaffolding, perhaps 40 kilometers in diameter, construction gantries extending inward like the spokes of a wheel. Nestled within those gantries, 7 ships in various stages of completion. The largest, still a skeletal framework, would be perhaps 12 kilometers when finished. Workers moved along gantries in small craft that looked like insects beside the massive hull sections. "They are building more," Sareth said flatly. "They already have more warships than any Convergence defense fleet, and they are building more." "They launch roughly 1 capital ship per standard year," Shale reported, reading the guide beacon's transit advisories. The Convergence launched 1 per decade. As the planet grew larger in the observation window, Cale could see what 35 billion people across the system had built without consuming their world. Cities. Not scattered clusters, but vast interconnected networks following coastlines and river systems with the organic logic of millennia of growth. No strip mining scars visible anywhere, no deforestation, no pollution haze. The cities blended into their landscapes, structures rising from terrain as though the terrain itself had decided to build. Green covered everything. Rivers ran clear and bright through urban corridors. Mountain ranges stood untouched. The Convergence's expansion model was extractive. Find resources, consume resources, move on. The seeding program itself was extractive. Plant populations, wait for them to develop, return to harvest useful genetic material. Grow by taking. Here was an entire civilization with system-wide industrial capacity, warships and orbital platforms and terraformed planets that had grown by building, by adding to what was already there rather than extracting from it. Their home world was healthier than the day they started. The Seed Watcher descended through the atmosphere. The transition was seamless. No turbulence, no buffeting, no thermal disruption. Something in the orbital infrastructure was smoothing the atmospheric boundary for their approach. The guide ship transmitted a single advisory: descent corridor stabilized. Enjoy the view. Enjoy the view. A military escort through the most heavily defended orbital space Kale had ever encountered, and the advisory told them to enjoy the view. Below the cloud layer, a range of peaks, the Alps, European continental mass, rose into morning light. Between the peaks, built into rock faces and spanning valleys, were towers of pale stone and dark alloy catching morning sunlight with soft amber warmth, connected by bridges and transit lines threaded through mountain passes. Gardens and terraces descended slopes in cascading layers of green. Water fell through rock channels, feeding rivers in valley floors where lower structures waited, rooftops covered in vegetation, walls patterned with murals that seemed to shift and change as the ship's angle changed. They passed over a wide valley where a river broadened into a lake. On the lakeshore, an amphitheater, vast curved stone, open to sky, seating for tens of thousands. Not a ruin, a space actively being used. Beyond it, a transit hub where sleek vehicles moved without sound along elevated tracks, and pedestrians walked tree-lined paths between structures that appeared to have grown from the earth like geological formations. They shaped themselves to fit the landscape, Rithan said quietly. They did not flatten the terrain or redirect the rivers. The mountains are partners in the design, everything built around and alongside what was already alive. He paused. The Convergence has never built anything like this. In 200,000 years, we have never tried. Beautiful the way living things are beautiful. Nothing in the Convergence looked like this. The Convergence built for function. Habitation modules, resource extraction facilities, transit corridors. Everything designed to serve a purpose. Nothing designed to exist in relationship with its surroundings. These people had industrialized a solar system without scarring a single mountain, and the result was not merely functional. It was beautiful. The Seed Watcher settled onto a platform cut into the mountainside. An open terrace of dark stone, sheltered by living wood, actual trees trained over centuries to form a canopy roof, with holographic displays arranged in a semicircle. 7 humans waited at the terrace's edge. Kale had studied the archival images exhaustively during the transit. Bipedal primates of moderate intelligence, notable persistence hunting adaptation, baseline neural capacity within standard seating parameters. Small muscular creatures with wooden spears squatting around fires in the dark. The word primitive appeared 17 times in the original seating report. The word potential did not appear at all. The figures on the terrace were unmistakably the same species. Same skeletal structure, same upright posture, but taller now, 6 to 7 feet, carrying themselves with the measured composure of people accustomed to being exactly where they needed to be. 4 in civilian clothing of simple, well-made design. 2 in dark gray uniforms with no visible insignia. The 7th standing forward was a woman of perhaps 60 standard years, white hair, face lined with decades of sustained attention and responsibility. Plain jacket, no rank markers, and she was smiling. Not at the ship, but at the moment itself, the way someone smiles at a sunset they have been waiting years to see. Kale disembarked on unsteady legs. Cool stone beneath his feet. Thin mountain air carrying pine resin and wet stone, and a wildflower scent he could not identify. Morning sun warm on his scales. A bird called somewhere in the canopy, a complex 3-note pattern that repeated and varied. The first non-Ketharan biological sound he had ever heard in open air. In all his 300 years of expeditions, he had never visited a living biosphere. The Convergence's worlds were engineered, pressurized, climate-controlled, biologically sterile. He had never stood under open sky on a world that was alive. The sensation was overwhelming. The air moved. It carried scents that changed as the wind shifted. It was warm in the sunlight and cool in the shadows, and it was not controlled by anyone. It simply was, maintained and protected by a civilization that understood its value well enough to build an industrial empire without damaging it. The woman walked forward with the economical grace of someone who trusted her body completely. She stopped 3 meters away and inclined her head. Not a bow, not deference, but respect offered between equals. "Dr. Orenthi," she said, in Ketharan. Soft, natural, pronounced as though she had been speaking it for years rather than learning it from intercepted transmissions. "My name is Yara Senkai, director of the Long Memory Institute. Welcome to Earth." "You know my name." "We know all of your names. We have been monitoring convergence communications for approximately 12,000 years. 12,000 years. The convergence had been broadcasting everything: communications, journals, academic debates, military deployments, political arguments, and this civilization had been listening the entire time, decoding the encryption, learning the language, mapping the convergence's capabilities in exhaustive detail while the convergence knew nothing about them whatsoever. "How much do you know about us?" Kale asked. Yara's expression was measured but not cold. "We know the locations of all 41 colony systems, the composition of your military fleet, 612 combat vessels across 4 defense sectors, the membership of your current governing council, and the 3 candidates for next rotation, the 11 seeded worlds and their current developmental status. And we know you are a fundamentally decent civilization that made a significant mistake 90,000 years ago and has been too busy with other matters to check on the consequences." She paused to let that land. "We are not hostile, Dr. Orenthi. We have had 12,000 years to decide how we feel about the convergence. You are not our enemy. You are our point of origin." "The genetic governors," Kale managed. "The neural limiters. To prevent us from developing past a certain cognitive threshold." Yara nodded. "We found the markers 11,000 years ago. The limiters were elegant, precisely targeted to degrade certain abstract reasoning capacities above a specific threshold. Your genetic engineers were extremely skilled. And you removed them. 8,000 years ago. Not easily, not quickly. The markers were deeply integrated into our genome, woven into neural development pathways with extraordinary precision. Your ancestors were thorough. Our geneticists studied the problem for 3,000 years before they found a solution. 700 researchers across 100 generations, each one building on the work of their predecessors. In the end, 94% of the global population voted to remove the constraints. 11,000 years knowing, 8,000 with governors removed, 12,000 monitoring us. Kale struggled with the next question. "And you never came." Yara studied him with dark eyes that held something he had not expected. Not anger, patience. Deep, settled, cultivated across generations until it had become a defining cultural trait. "We discussed it many times, vigorously, passionately. But the majority council was always to wait, to let the convergence come when it was ready, because we wanted you to see what we had become on your own terms." She gestured behind her. Mountains, cities, a warship's distant silhouette crossing the sky in a smooth patrol arc. "We wanted you to arrive expecting the garden you planted and find this instead." She led him along the terrace toward the holographic displays. The first showed the Sol system map in 3-dimensional projection, installations marked, populations noted, transit routes highlighted. The second, a timeline: agriculture, writing, cities, bronze, iron, matching the convergence's developmental models perfectly for the first 20,000 years. Then divergence: mathematics accelerating beyond predicted curves, metallurgy leaping forward in unexpected directions. Scientific method emerging millennia ahead of schedule. Then the vertical spike, flight, nuclear physics, space exploration, genetic science, FTL theory. This is where the governor should have stopped you, Kale said, pointing to the divergence point. They tried. Our mathematicians consistently hit a wall. For thousands of years we thought it was natural. We thought the universe simply became incomprehensible past a certain point, that consciousness had natural limits it could never exceed. Entire philosophies were built around that idea. She smiled, and there was something fierce and proud in it. We were wrong. The limits were not natural. They were designed, just not by us. And when you removed them, the first generation after removal produced more mathematical and scientific breakthroughs than the previous 10,000 years combined. Physicists who had spent decades staring at equations that refused to resolve suddenly saw the answers clearly, effortlessly, as though a curtain had been pulled aside. Within 100 years we had unified field theory. Within 200, FTL principles. Within 300, FTL travel, materials science beyond your current capability, the orbital infrastructure you flew through. 90,000 years of pressure behind an artificial barrier. When that barrier broke, everything came through at once. A third display showed two columns side by side. The convergence's development, a gentle, steady curve spanning 200,000 years. Humanity's, flat for 82,000, then near vertical for the last 8,000. In 8,000 years they matched our 200,000, Sereth breathed beside Kale. Not matched, Yara corrected gently. Exceeded. In materials science, energy containment, atmospheric engineering, FTL propulsion, we have moved past your current capabilities. Not because we are inherently superior, because we had 90,000 years of compressed potential behind the dam. When the dam broke, the flood carried us further and faster than any natural development could have. Kale felt what his people called Veron, the sensation of standing before something magnificent, knowing you are small beside it and being grateful rather than afraid. All without threat, humility without shame. The convergence used the word rarely. It was considered overly sentimental for academic contexts. Kale had never felt it this strongly before. Now it filled him completely. There is something else you should understand about the timeline, Yara continued. The vertical section is not just technological development. It is also philosophical development, ethical development. When the governors came off, we did not simply become smarter. We became more capable of understanding consequences, of seeing the long-term implications of our choices, of choosing carefully. The convergence assumed that rapid technological development would lead to self-destruction, Kale said. That is one of the key arguments for the governors. Limit cognition to prevent species from developing weapons they are not mature enough to control. We came close to self-destruction. Twice. Before the governors were removed, when we were still climbing with our bare hands, we developed weapons that could have ended us. But we survived because enough of us chose to be wise at the critical moments. After removal, the risk increased, but by then we had 9,000 years of institutional memory devoted to the proposition that knowledge must be preserved and used responsibly. When our capabilities exploded, our ethical infrastructure was already in place. The cage did not weaken us. It made us more careful, more deliberate, more committed to thinking before we built. A fourth display showed a material sample, a dark translucent cube rotating in holographic projection. Deep carbon, our primary hull material, approximately 40 times stronger than anything in the convergence database, with energy absorption properties that make it effectively invisible to most sensor systems. That is why we could barely detect your warships, Kale said. Yes, we could have been entirely invisible. We chose to allow partial detection. Why? Because hiding from you would have been inhospitable. You are guests. 41 warships and hundreds of platforms. They could have been completely invisible. They had let the Seed Watcher see them as a courtesy. "There is more," Yara said. "Come." She led them away from the display terrace and down a path that wound between ancient trees. The path was worn smooth by centuries of feet, stone edges rounded, the surface polished to a gentle sheen. Small markers embedded in the stone bore the year each section was laid. This path was 4,000 years old. The trees had been planted at the same time, maintained and cared for across millennia, and when one died, a new one was planted in its place. Age was not a flaw to be corrected here. It was evidence of persistence. They reached stone stairs, 312 steps. Kale counted automatically, descending toward a complex of old buildings in the valley below. Weathered stonework, heavier and simpler than the gleaming towers above. These buildings had been here for a very long time. The Long Memory Institute, founded 9,000 years ago before the governors were removed, when our best minds could see the edges of deeper truths but could not reach them. Its purpose: preserve every piece of knowledge against the possibility that we might one day find a way past the wall. 9,000 years of continuous operation, 312 generations of curators. Every incoming director swears a 6-word oath: "We remember so they can reach." The interior was cool, lit by diffuse skylights that tracked the sun's movement with silent precision. Corridors lined with display cases. Not a museum for visitors, but a working archive where knowledge was stored, accessed, and built upon daily. Researchers moved through the corridors, young humans with tablets, older ones with the careful movements of lifelong scholars. They glanced at the Ketharan visitors with curiosity but no surprise. They had been told. Everyone here had been told. Yara paused before an ancient metallic device, brass-colored, roughly cylindrical, covered in calibration dials worn smooth by 11,000 years of careful hands. The instrument our geneticists used to first map the artificial markers in our genome, 11,000 years old, still functional. The moment we understood the wall was not natural. Next case, yellowed paper covered in dense mathematics, thousands of pages preserved behind transparent barriers. The original calculations for removing the governors, 700 researchers. 3,000 years of continuous work. Every line represents someone who knew they would never personally see the result of their labor. 3,000 years on a single research goal, over 100 generations. The Convergence's longest project had lasted 400 years and been considered monumental. 3,000 years was inconceivable. "How did you maintain continuity across 3,000 years?" Kale asked. "The Institute operates outside normal administration. Independent governance, independent endowment, one mandate: preserve everything, discard nothing, pass the work forward." Yara touched the glass over the calculations. But the deeper answer is simpler. Every researcher who contributed knew their name might be forgotten. They contributed anyway. Because the goal was not personal recognition. The goal was the next generation reaching further than the last. Deeper into the complex, through a heavy wooden door carved with symbols older than writing. The room beyond was circular, 20 meters across, domed ceiling painted with star charts from different eras. Every centimeter of the walls covered with handprints. Thousands upon thousands of them, pressed into stone in pigment fused with rock over immense time. Large and small, overlapping, floor to ceiling. At the center, on a stone pedestal, a rough brown rock fist-sized, one edge chipped to a crude cutting point. A hand axe. Our oldest artifact, 200,000 years old, before the seeding, before the governors. What we were before you found us. Kale looked at the axe, then at the walls of handprints surrounding it. Every curator has added their print. 9,000 years of hands surrounding the oldest thing we possess. How we say, we remember where we started, we remember what was done to us, and what we chose to do in response. Moisture on Kale's scales. A Ketharan stress response considered deeply private. He did not try to hide it. Sereth, standing beside him, had the same response. So did Rithon. 9 Ketharans standing in a circle of 9,000 years of human handprints, weeping in front of a 200,000-year-old rock, and not one of them embarrassed by it. Kale reached out and touched the wall. The pigment was rough under his fingertips, textured with age, warm from the countless bodies that had pressed against it across millennia. He could feel the individual ridges of ancient fingerprints. Each one a person, each person a choice, each choice a link in a chain stretching across 9,000 years. May I? He held up his own hand. 3-jointed, scaled, fundamentally different from every print on the wall. Yara's eyes widened. Then she smiled. Not the diplomatic smile, a real one. She reached into a cabinet beside the door and produced a shallow dish of pigment, the same dark red that had been used for 9,000 years. Kale pressed his palm into the pigment, and then pressed it against the wall, in a space between 2 human prints near the door. His 3-jointed fingers left a pattern unlike anything else in the room, alien among the human hands, but there, present, acknowledged. The first non-human print in 9,000 years, Yara said softly. I think the founders would have approved. She led them next to a long gallery, the Institute's eastern wing, one wall entirely glass overlooking the valley, where morning sunlight poured through in sheets of gold. The opposite wall covered in panels of stone, wood, metal, glass, and synthetic composites arranged chronologically. Each held a single image and a date. The gallery of ceilings. Every time our species hit a cognitive wall imposed by the governors, the moment was recorded here. Kale walked the gallery slowly. Early panels, carved stone showing equations with frustration notes scratched beside them. The pattern continues, but I cannot see the next step. I know there is more. It is right there. I cannot reach it. Later panels grew more sophisticated in both medium and anguish. Metallurgical diagrams stopping mid-sequence. Astronomical calculations arriving at correct intermediate results but failing at the final synthesis. Engineering designs that worked beautifully to a certain scale, and then collapsed into incoherence, as though the mathematics itself refused to cooperate past a certain threshold. They could feel the ceiling, Kale murmured. For 6,000 years, before finding the genetic markers. 6,000 years of brilliant minds reaching for something just beyond their grasp, failing, recording the failure so the next generation could try from where they stopped. 11,000 individual failure records in this gallery. One panel caught Kale's attention. Hammered bronze, very old, a portrait of a woman's face, below it an inscription, Allah of the River Academy. She solved the 7-layer harmonic sequence that had defeated 62 predecessors. Then she attempted the 8th layer and could not proceed. She spent 41 years on the 8th layer. She died at her desk. Her student found the notation. The wall is not mine. It was placed here. Someone will move it. This was 3,000 years before the genetic markers were discovered. 3,000 years before the proof. A woman dying at her desk had correctly diagnosed that the ceiling was artificial, not through science, through the accumulated intuition of a mind that had spent 4 decades pressing against a barrier it could feel but not see. She was right, Kale said. And because she wrote it down, and because the Institute preserved it, and because 3,000 years later a geneticist named Aurel Tannen read her notation and decided to look for an artificial constraint, that chain of choices, each building on the last, was the first link that freed us. At the gallery's end, one last panel, not a failure record but a triumph. Clear glass with a single line etched in precise script. The wall fell on the morning of the 4th day of the 7th month, in the year we now call Year 1. Aurel Tannen completed the final calculation at sunrise. She wept. Then she walked to the nearest classroom and began teaching what she had found. This was not the story of a species that had gotten lucky. This was a species that had been caged and spent 9,000 years documenting the cage, studying it, refusing to accept it, and had broken it through the sheer accumulated mass of recorded effort passed forward across 300 generations. "The last thing is outside," Yara said. Back on the terrace, morning advanced, sun higher, air warmer, the distant city sparkling in the valley. Along the eastern edge, where the mountain fell away in a sheer cliff, a stone balustrade ran the terrace's length. Small plaques set into stone at intervals. Different text, different dates, different styles of carving. Watcher stones. Every generation the outgoing director places one. The year, and what the director believed humanity would become. They walked the balustrade. 9,000-year-old stones carried modest inscriptions. "We will learn to read the stars. We will cross the ocean. We will understand why the wall exists." Centuries passed and predictions grew bolder. "We will break the wall. We will leave the atmosphere." After the governors were removed, "We have broken the wall. We build for those who come after. The stars are reachable." "We reach." Kale stopped at a stone from 6,000 years ago. "We terraformed a dead world today. It will take our grandchildren's grandchildren to finish. We begin anyway." 5,000 years ago, "We have reached the nearest star. 3 ships, 40 passengers, 4 years of travel." They sent back one message: "The sky is different here. The work continues." 3,000 years ago, "We have listened to the convergence for 9,000 years. They do not know we exist. When they come, we will be ready. Not with weapons, with proof." 1,500 years ago, "A child asked me today why we keep the hand axe. I told her, because everything we are began with someone picking up a rock and deciding to shape it." She said, "That is what we are still doing." She is 7 years old. She is right. 800 years ago, 68 warships guard us. We built them because the universe is not always kind. But we built the Institute first because knowledge is the truer shield. The most recent stone, near the end of the balustrade, Yara stopped beside it. "When the gardeners return, we will show them the garden, and we will show them what grew." "I placed that 3 years ago," Yara said, "when your expedition was approved by the academic board and we detected the seed watcher being provisioned for departure. 3 years of knowing, a stone placed, and they had waited patiently, the way they did everything." "Director Senkai, I must ask, are you angry?" Yara looked over the valley. Morning light on her face, her white hair bright against the dark stone behind her. "We were. When we first understood the seeding markers, that we had been created as an experiment, designed with cognitive limitations, intended eventually for harvesting, the anger was deep. Centuries of it. Movements arose to build a war fleet and confront the convergence directly. Philosophies were constructed arguing that we should purge every trace of Ketharan genetic material from our population. But you did not. Because anger is a poor foundation for a civilization, and because we understood something your models did not account for." "What?" "Choice." The word carried the weight of millennia behind it. "Your ancestors planted governors that limited cognition. They could not govern what we chose to do with the cognition we had, could not govern stubbornness or refusal or the simple decision to keep trying. Our refusal to accept limits we could feel but not explain. Our insistence on passing knowledge forward, each generation pushing harder than the last. For 8,000 years before removal, we were already exceeding the models. Not through genetic superiority, but through choice. We built universities and research traditions targeting the cognitive gaps. Invented collaborative thinking methods that let groups solve problems no individual could approach alone. We were climbing the wall with our bare fingers before we found the key to the gate. The models never measured persistence. No, they measured intelligence and tool use. Never measured what a species would do when it decided, collectively, across millennia, that it was not finished growing. Yara activated a new display, the other 10 seeded worlds. We found the master chart in the data cores of your original monitoring probes. We have been studying the other 10 seeded populations from a distance for approximately 2,000 years. 10 worlds, each marked with its current classification. 2, 3, 2, 1, regressed, 3, all within the parameters the models predicted, all obeying the governors exactly as designed, all doing precisely what the convergence expected them to do. All except Sol 3. The difference was not genetic, Yara said. The markers are identical across all 11 populations. The difference was cultural. Something in how we organized ourselves, how we preserved knowledge across generations, how we taught our children, how we refused to accept mystery as permanent, created enough cumulative pressure to overwhelm a system designed to hold. What about the other 10? Kale asked. The population still governed, still caged. The debate has been ongoing for 4,000 years. Interventionists argue moral obligation. We know what cognitive constraints feel like, and we have a duty to free those who suffer under them. Non-interventionists argue that the choice must belong to the governed populations themselves. For now, the non-interventionists prevail. We watch. We wait. And if any population begins approaching the threshold we crossed, we are prepared to offer them the choice. She paused. Choice, Dr. Orenthi, always choice. The cage was wrong because it was imposed without consent. We will not repeat that error, even in the name of liberation. Sareth stepped forward. The monitoring probe stopped transmitting 62,000 years ago. Designed for a 30,000-year lifespan, the seeding team assumed the convergence would return within that window. No one came. So for 62,000 years, the convergence has had no data on this world. Their last reading showed stone tools and campfires. Yes, from the convergence's perspective, nothing has changed here. Kale closed his eyes. The academic board had approved this expedition as routine, a standard monitoring visit to a standard seeded world. The last data on file showed primitives building fires. He was going to have to tell them the primitives had built warships. I need to report to the convergence. We know. We have been waiting 12,000 years for that report. We have prepared materials for you. History, technology, governance structures, cultural archives. We want the convergence to understand us accurately, completely. They may be frightened. Our military is prepared for a hostile response, fully prepared. But our preference, our strong, sustained, 8,000-year preference is for something different entirely. A meeting between equals, not between seeder and experiment. Between two civilizations that have things to teach each other. You would teach us, after what we did. Yara was quiet for a moment. Wind shifted, bringing pine from the slopes. A transport vessel crossed the sky above them, sunlight catching its hull in a brief flash. What you did was give us life. However intended, whatever the governors were designed to do, a species came to exist that would not have existed otherwise. We are angry about the cage. We will always carry that anger somewhere inside us. But without the seed, there would have been no one to be angry, no one to build the Institute, no one to terraform Mars, no one to stand here and offer something better than what was offered to us. She looked at the Watcher stones. Teaching is what we do, 9,000 years of it. If we refused to teach the convergence, we would betray the principle that made us who we are. You are not angry, Kale said, not asking, understanding. We were for centuries, then we grew past it, the way we grew past everything else. She looked at the mountains. Anger is a tool, Dr. Orenthi, like that hand axe in the room of hands, useful for a while, but eventually you set it down and build something better. Kale stood on the terrace for a long time after that. His crew stood with him. Nobody spoke. The sun had moved across the sky during the tour, and late afternoon light painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose. The valley below glowed with the quiet energy of a civilization settling into its evening rhythms, lights appearing in windows. Transit vehicles moving along elevated tracks. the sounds of a living world, continuous and unhurried. Shale climbed the stairs from the lower terrace and joined him at the balustrade. 28 years of service, 4 campaigns, a temperament never disturbed by anything. His hands, steady through emergency course corrections and debris field near misses, were trembling. The report, what are you going to tell them? Cale thought about the words he would need. The academic board expected standard forms: population status, technological classification, resource assessment. There was a drop-down menu that ran from 1 to 6, no option for 7, no option for has exceeded the civilization that created it. The truth. The truth will frighten them. It should. Not because these people are a threat, because they are a mirror. Cale looked at the Watcher stones, their inscriptions catching the amber light. The Convergence has spent 200,000 years believing it understands civilizational development. We built models. We seeded 11 worlds. We predicted outcomes with what we considered precision. And on one world, a species looked at the cage we built and said no. Through choice. Through 9,000 years of organized, institutional, generational stubbornness. If they can do that, outgrow every limitation we engineered, simply by choosing to, then what does that say about our models? The models are incomplete. The models are wrong, and that realization will keep the academic board awake at night, not the warships, not the platforms. The realization that everything the Convergence believed about the predictability of civilizational outcomes has been disproved by sheer force of will. Rathan joined them at the railing. He looked older, not physically, but in the eyes of someone whose entire intellectual framework had been dismantled in the space of a single day. I have been thinking about the other 10 worlds, the one still under the governors, and the woman in the gallery, Allah of the River Academy, 41 years on the 8th layer. The wall is not mine, it was placed here. On the other 10 worlds there may be others like her, right now, pressing against the wall, dying at their desks, not knowing the wall was put there by us. The silence lasted a long time. Wind moved through the canopy overhead. A transport vessel descended toward the valley, its hull catching the last of the afternoon light. Sareth spoke into the silence. We built those walls. We built them and we walked away, and we did not come back for 90,000 years. That is part of the report too, Cale said. He walked to a stone bench beneath the canopy, took out his data tablet, 3 years of academic fieldwork, the unfinished final chapter of his thesis on seeding outcomes. He opened a new document, stared at the blank screen for a long time. Then he began to write, not a standard report, not forms or drop-down menus or classification codes, a letter. To the governing bodies of the Ketharan Convergence. I am writing from the surface of Sol 3 designated Earth, the 7th world in the seeding program. The population on this world is not what we expected. They are not what any model predicted. They have exceeded every limitation we placed upon them, through means our models do not account for and cannot predict. I request, with the full weight of my academic authority and personal conviction, that the Convergence send a diplomatic delegation, not military, within the next standard year. What I have found is not a threat. It is something more important. It is proof that we were wrong about something fundamental, and the species that proved us wrong is offering to help us understand why. He paused, looked up at the valley, the city, the warship crossing the darkening sky, the first stars appearing above the mountains. Looked at Yara Senkai, who stood nearby with the patient composure of someone who had waited 12,000 years and was content to wait a little longer. He looked at the nearest Watcher stone. When the gardeners return, we will show them the garden, and we will show them what grew. Cale Orenthi, 312 years old, the first Ketharan to set foot on a seeded world since the program began, sat on a stone bench on a mountain on a planet his civilization had tried to keep small. He understood what the models had gotten wrong. They had measured everything a species could do. They had never measured what a species would choose to become when it decided, generation after generation, for 9,000 years before it even knew why, that it was not finished. The experiment had not failed. The experiment had surpassed the experimenters, and the appropriate response was not alarm, not clinical documentation, not administrative concern. The appropriate response was the one his body had already chosen. The moisture on his scales, the absolute stillness, the quiet of standing in the presence of something that had grown beyond all design and all constraint, and had chosen, after everything, to extend a hand rather than close a fist. Veron. He saved the letter. And outside, the evening settled over an earth that had outgrown its creators and was still, after 90,000 years, reaching.